one of the bits of advice that I've found particularly helpful is to do with our sort of inner narrative and how that departs from the perspective we have when we're advising friends. So when we are advising friends, we are very much more rational, and we can sort of see things from a point standing away. And how can we then try and apply that greater rationality to our own judgments about ourselves, as you talk about?
It's so much easier with other people, but the point is, it's sort of the nature of storytelling, you know, that life is actually complex and messy. There's an infinite data source coming at us, an infinite number of things that we could pay attention to, but we choose what we're going to pay attention to, and we join up the dots in a particular way so we can make sense of and have a story of what's going on, which allows us to move forward and, you know, sort of basically function. But when our friends and other people tell us of their conflicts and the things that are making them angry and so on, and they tell us these stories, we're normally very aware of the fact that they're stories, and we're very aware that there's clearly another side going on, and we sort of gently sort of might try and nudge them to a sort of understanding that, oh, maybe it was this, and maybe he just meant this, and perhaps this other thing might be going, and we sort of try and bring a more charitable interpretation of what might be going on into the picture. But we are terrible at doing that for ourselves. But we do need to, because I think this is what we do throughout all of life. Right from the word go, we're told to sort of banish parts of us that are wrong, and we kind of shove bits out of the picture that don't fit what we think is right. And as we grow up, those parts of us that then are sort of not honored can come to own us, because they sort of have this sort of unconscious power that can sort of bubble away. So even at that level, as we grow up, and particularly as you get into the second half of life, I think this becomes more important. You know they're there because they're exactly the sort of things that creep into the same problems that occur in your relationships one after another, or the sort of strange addictions we have, or the things we always avoid. They're normally those parts of us that we buried are just sort of sounding themselves from a distance and letting themselves be known, bubbling away and owning us strangely. So the way around that is to sort of find out what they are and try and include them more in our sense of self and try and honor them in some way. And likewise, all the things we banish from the stories that we tell tend to be the things that create these conflicts. And somehow we just need to sit in a certain amount of ambiguity more and not always go for this sort of certainty. The nature of telling ourselves a story about the world, stories are about graceful arcs, aren't they? They're kind of like when you watch a film, everything sort of kind of makes sense, and all the stuff that's too nuanced or conflicting or messy gets excluded, and we sort of try and apply this same model to the world, and of course that just isn't the reality. And our certainty about something is really only a narration of how much ambiguity we're actually willing to tolerate, and we need to tolerate it more as we grow up.
So are you saying, in a sense, then, that all the messiness and the complication and the story that doesn't fit the sort of, you know, neat narrative is there in our minds, and we push it to the back of our minds, but we're sort of trying to live a kind of false way of living that sort of fits to a story that's too neat, and we just need to sort of accept all the messiness and complexity?
Yeah. Essentially, I mean, and I think sometimes that's easier than others, and sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. So in times of crisis, it's not helpful. In times of crisis, language does become very certain, and our stories have to be quite like that, because otherwise, you know, you can't go to war unless you're all rallying under the same cry. So nuance kind of has to be lost. But some people live out life like it is a crisis. You know, some people do. If you're prone to anxiety, that will sort of be your mode most of the time, and that's not really, it's not really helpful. So what that is at the heart of it is saying it's not so much about owning our stories. We're told this a lot, you know, own your story. I think it's more about just recognizing that they are just stories. You know, there's a nice picture of you know, stories of things told around firelight in clearings. I and you've got all this forest around you that's just in darkness. This is all the stuff that's excluded, while you've got this cozy little firelit center. And all the monsters are in the darkness. You know, all the stuff that's excluded is out there. And that is the stuff that will come back and get you, whether it's things in yourself that you're not honoring, or whether it's things in the world that you're just having to banish so that you can. This is what fundamentalism is, isn't it? It's just somebody not tolerating ambiguity. Fundamentalism plus power becomes tyranny. And if you're banishing anything that conflicts with your neat sense of how the world must be out into the forest, out into the darkness, you've got to really work to maintain that world. And the only way you can do that is by trying to control everything in it to fit in with this slightly pathological story you've got of how the world is. So the only answer is to sit more comfortably with ambiguity and to see it is just a story, and slowly allow those kind of monsters to lose their power.
You say you know, will be prone to anxiety, and sort of it's all the way through. The most important premise is this idea of trying to control, understand, and accept what we can control, and relinquish, you know, let go of the things that we can't control. And today I was thinking, right, I can do that. And then I realized it's very hard to distinguish between the two. I was thinking, well, I can't control that. I must let it pass, and it's all okay. As you say in the book, it's, you know, it's all fine. And then I thought, actually, I probably could, you know, call someone up and try and change that or manipulate it. It's very hard to distinguish between what you can and can't control.
Yeah, so again, you can distinguish between intention and outcomes. So the big Stoic fork is between what you're in control of and what you're not. And what you are in control of are your thoughts and your actions, right? So what you do, what you put out in the world, and what you choose to think about, like that's hard enough, right? But at least that's, in theory, you're kind of in charge of those things. That's your domain. That's where your tasks are as a human being in the world. All the other stuff, what other people do and what they think about, and what happens in the world, and what the outcomes of things are, let alone, you know, what your neighbors are up to, or how well other people do their jobs, or all the things that annoy us, those are not under our control. And the mistake we make is to try and control those things. Most of the time, that's what we're trying to do. And of course, if you try and control something that you have no control over, you're just going to frustrate yourself. And this is exactly the kind of unnecessary disturbance that this model is about, right? So how do you avoid that? You decide that all of those things are fine, and you're only going to concern yourself with your thoughts and your actions. Now, you're right. That makes sense, but generally in life, because it is nuanced and complex and messy, things aren't that neat. And sometimes you're in a situation where you're like, well, I am partially in control of this. But the same fork applies. So if you imagine playing a game of tennis, and if you go into a game of tennis thinking, I must win, right? You are trying to control something that is not under your control. And most likely, if you start to lose, if your opponent's better than you, you'll start to feel anxious because it will feel like you're failing, and you are failing, essentially. So you won't play as well. The alternative is to go into that game thinking, I'll play as well as I can, and I'll play to the best of my abilities. Now, that's something you're in control of, right? That's back on the side of your thoughts and your actions. If your opponent turns out to be better than you, you've no reason to feel anxious because you're not failing. You are succeeding still in your aim, and you'll play better. And tennis players will tell you this: you will play better if you make that your aim. So sometimes it's about that. It's just picking apart what are the bits. So like matters of social injustice. So like, what if you do actually want to change the world? What if that's a really important thing to sometimes. And the Stoics were big movers and shakers. They were politicians, statesmen, emperors. You know, these were not. It's not just about. It isn't about complacency and about going, oh, well, that's fine, I'm not going to bother. It can be like that. It depends how you are, kind of constitutionally, I guess. Yeah. So in things with matters like that, it's separating again. What are you in control of? You're in control of how much effort you put into what you do. So you could spend your life fully emotionally committed to changing something in the sense of doing your best to sort out this social problem as you see it. But you're not going to commit yourself to an outcome because that outcome might happen 3 generations later anyway. It might be nothing to do with you. And if you do pin yourself to that, you're just going to get bitter and anxious and too angry and all of those things that are actually going to get in the way of you doing a good job. So you're just separating what you are in control of from what you're not. And separating outcomes from intention is one aspect of that. What I find for myself is that thought of like, which side of the line is it? And I think a big thing of it, just having the sort of security, having the understanding that, oh, it's fine. If it's on this side, if it's on the external side, as in not my thoughts and actions, then it's fine. It is fine as it is. Understanding that like nothing bad happens if you do that. Nothing bad happens if you decide those things are fine. And as I said, sometimes you're going to pick it apart because you can still influence things in that world, but only to the extent of what's, what you're in control of. Sorry, weirdly, my emails all just came up. Then let me get rid of those. So you're separating those two things. But that thought of how is the question I ask is how could it be fine for this thing to be the case? This thing that's bothering me, how could it just be fine that that's like that? And sometimes the answer is easy. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it just needs to drip in, just sort of drip by drip into the soul. But that's the key thought. And for me, it's like waking up as a kid on a Saturday morning and you think you have to go to school, then you remember it's Saturday and you don't have to. That sort of rush of relief of, oh, it's fine. It's fine that this guy's a dick and fine that these people don't like you, fine, whatever. That's fine. That's their own stuff. That's fine. It's fine that I didn't get the job, didn't get the promotion, didn't get the thing. That was somebody else's. Or, it's fine. That's not your job to have or do those things, or it's not your job to have everybody like you, or it's not your job to whatever. Your job is about what you put out in the world yourself. So I don't know if that makes any sense. I was distracted by my emails coming in, so I may have started talking rubbish halfway through.
Yeah, no answering of emails during that.
Oh no, I'm not. I'm just trying to get rid of them. They coming across the screen.
But, in a sense, so if success then is not about reaching a goal, so to say I've succeeded is not about I won, I got there, I did it, I made it. What is success about? You talk about in the book, it's about talent and energy, for example, and I'm wondering if you could explain that a little more.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, ultimately success is going to be about a relationship between what happens in the world and what your expectations were, right? So if your expectations are just to do as well as you can in something, then you can still feel a success in that, even if the results, even if you don't win the thing, whatever, like the tennis game. So that's just a relationship between what you expect. And there's a lot of power in lowering your expectations. But in terms of like what we can do towards success in all its more obvious forms in life, again, it's just what happens if you separate the two. The bits you're in control of are your talent, so developing your talent, and the energy with which you get it out there. Right. So if you've got all the talent in the world, but you never show anybody, no one's going to see it, then you're not going to get very far. And if you have got all the self-promotional energy, but no talent to back it up, then again, it's probably not going to get you very far. So those are the only things that you're in control of. So those are the only things you need to pay attention to. And all the other stuff, whether you get the phone call, whether you get given the job, whether you get the gig, whatever, you have no control over that. So you can just decide that is none of your business. And focus. You're not going to make it any better by trying to control those things. All you're going to do is make yourself anxious at every audition you go to, or every whatever it is. But what you can focus on and where you put all your energy is into your thought, your talent and your energy. And of course, then this also ties in with the whole thing of you get to enjoy the journey. It becomes about the journey rather than just the destination. So that's sort of the key. If there's a magic formula for success, it's talent and energy, and everything else is neither here nor there. You have no control over it.
And you say, there's so many bits I'd love to talk about, but I'm very worried I must allow the millions of questions that are coming in to be answered. But one of the things you say is we are not so special. Again, it's a sort of myth of the self-help industry, perhaps, that we must imagine, we are unique and we are special. And I'm wondering why you think we shouldn't have that idea, because in many ways that's what helps us feel a sense of sort of self-worth, the idea that we're worth it, as the self-help would say.
Yeah, I think we get a little bit too hung up on things like self-esteem. I don't know anyone that's got high self-esteem, and people that do seem to have it are normally the ones that don't have it at all, because you only need if you need that back, you only need the stuff that you don't have, right? If you go through life, putting that out, it's enough to just, I think, find something worthwhile to do, and to do that in the best way. So we get a little bit hung up on things like self-esteem and self-worth. Of course, there are times, and it's a slightly rhetorical point in the book, you're not so special, but it is a useful thought sometimes, because the flip side of thinking that we're special is that we miss out on the tremendous power of how much like other people we actually are. So life, I think, is centripetal, right? It pulls towards the center. And we have all sorts of distractions and things on the outside, but eventually there will be things that happen that pull us to difficult moments in the middle. And when those do happen, we can feel like we failed, we tend to feel fearful, we feel anxious, and we certainly feel isolated. But those moments when life is doing that, we are feeling the precise weight of life, right? All the distractions have gone. We're feeling what life is really handing us. This is the weight of existence. And it's the one thing we share with everybody, because everybody gets to that same point. So we feel most isolated, but actually we are most connected with other people. It's very hard to do that if we're convinced that we're special and unique. Whereas if we allow ourselves to also be quite ordinary, and that the problems we have are probably things that other people are sharing. So look, take the lockdown. This is a very literal example of this. We are literally isolated, but we're all sharing in the same thing. So you could take two kind of ways of looking at this in terms of dealing with anxiety. One would be the Stoic approach, which is just decide that all the madness in the world is fine. You're just going to roll with it, and what you're going to pay attention to is what you do. Whether you're going to wear a mask, you're going to do this, you're going to deal with your own stuff and get on with it. And that can include helping others and all those other things, but you're just paying attention to your own project, your own task through all of this, and deciding everything else is sort of none of your business. Meanwhile, the complete opposite of that, if that's about avoiding anxiety, is to sort of say, well, anxiety this is part of life, and a certain amount of melancholy maybe is sort of appropriate given how life can be. So we're going to kind of just going to let that sit and go, that's okay. This is part of our condition. And when you start to lean into that, it's a very different route, but suddenly we're in this thing that we're all sharing. And then there's something very human about that we can then take into the rest of life with all our problems and all our stuff, and realize that it's, we're all going through it, irrespective of what people look like and the curated versions of themselves that they put out on Instagram and to our faces when we meet, that actually we're all largely going through the same stuff underneath.
I was going to ask you whether you thought that, of course, sort of social media and striving to live up to kind of ideals that everybody puts out there, is a sort of new thing, and how much of of a problem that causes. But I would say I do think that there's a move at the moment towards sort of a sharing of more of vulnerability. So there's definitely a kind of move on social media and things like that, which perhaps you must think is a good thing, when whether it's celebrities or normal people writing about it, about sort of things that have gone wrong and how they've failed or how they're vulnerable, is becoming much more of a thing.
Yeah, well, there's this basic problem, which is, when we meet people, let alone on social media, they present the best versions of themselves normally. So we're seeing a kind of a veneer where things look great, and we tend to compare that with our inner workings, which are messy and complex and embarrassing and all sorts of stuff. It's like a big lumbering giant we have following us around. That's our private life, and we make the mistake of comparing people's external appearance, or at least what they put out in the world, that veneer, to all of that stuff. And yeah, social media just makes that even worse. And if that's all you've known, if you're of an age, that's what you're sort of growing up with, and that's all you know, I don't know how you begin to navigate that. So yeah, part of the problem is the technology is amazing, but it doesn't quite tie in with our values. It needs shifting. It needs a sort of ethical input. There are people like Tristan Harris. There's a great documentary called The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which I'm sure a lot of people will have seen, who's a real kind of pioneer in trying to bring technology, just to give it a kind of ethical nudge, to bring it more in line with human values. And that's missing. And yeah, social media is the worst for it. It's also great in lots of ways, right? But that is a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, in a way, as I said, it brings us together in our sort of vulnerability, as you were saying, like rather than being, on our own, thinking we're special and unique, it has a way of kind of making us realize other people are going through the same sorts of things. There's so many questions. I'm just going to ask my very last thing, which I wanted to ask you about, was you talk about embracing the possibility of loss, and always, in order to appreciate something we have, whether it's a relationship, mainly in relationships you refer to it, we should always be sort of at the edge of our mind thinking that we stand to lose that thing. And I wonder if that isn't more anxiety inducing. If you're always worrying about losing something, are you not missing the joy?
Oh, of course. And I'm not suggesting people should always worry about losing things at all. I didn't mean it quite like that. But it's just about not taking things for granted. So the Stoics, again, the 2,000-year-old idea, they would say, go without hot baths so that you realize you don't take nice baths for granted when they do come along. So it's just extending that. They even said, when you kiss your child goodnight, you should remind yourself that she may die during the night. I've got a dog. I've got a couple of dogs, but I've got think about favorite dog here. She's already halfway through her life, and I'm really trying to kind of make sure I do enjoy, and I'm very present with her, because it won't be that long before she goes. So yeah, it can all sound a bit morbid, but the point is just, and the value of it is that a lot of these things, that when we feel we just own things, we start to take them for granted. And when we take them for granted, we don't desire, right? We don't desire things that we have. Part of the way of spicing up long-term relationships, because you love the person that you're with, but you desire things that you don't have, right? So that's why sexy times often get fewer and fewer with people that you're in long-term relationships with, because you love them and you have them, and it's hard to balance that with desire, which is a strange thing. So part of the answer to that, and the reason why people can be oddly, our partners can be oddly sexy if we see them perform or see them do really well in a business meeting and other people really admiring them or whatever, we start to see them through other people's eyes, and finding ways of reinstating their kind of otherness. So we stop just taking them for granted, like we just own them and they're just going to be there all the time. I think is important. It's just about not taking things for granted. But yes, of course, it's not about just adding worry. It's just a thought to lean into sometimes.
Yeah, there's a whole nother discussion in that, the idea of, I'm of the hot bath theory, but actually people tell me just enjoy things more. Don't always feel you have to deserve everything by having, cold baths in order to appreciate the hot. But there's another discussion in that. And there are so many questions here. My goodness,